Hi everybody, my name's Nadine and I'm a third year exercise and sports student from Central Queensland University. Today I would like to talk to you about some research that we conducted at Rockhampton in 2014. What we were doing is a comparison of active versus passive recovery during a repeat sprint protocol. This is an overview of what I will be talking to you today. Repeat sprint ability is the ability to recover and maintain maximal effort during subsequent sprints where recovery bouts are less than or equal to 30 seconds. Many team sports such as basketball, hockey, rugby, soccer and even AFL require short bursts of high intensity activity with small amounts of interspersed rest. It's normally required during critical moments of the game. A game can either be lost or won on a player's ability to sprint faster than their opponent. Improving RSA and optimizing recovery is essential to maintaining high athletic performance. RSA mainly uses the anaerobic energy system. Sufficient recovery is required for performance in subsequent sprints. This causes increased muscle blood flow, lactate clearance. It allows for ATP. RSA mainly uses the anaerobic energy system. Sufficient recovery is required for performance in subsequent sprints. In this recovery time, we see an increased muscle blood flow, lactate clearance, ATP is resynthesized through the breakdown of phosphocreatine, and there's also removal of accumulated inorganic phosphates and hydrogen ions. Sprint duration and recovery time is a determinant in RSA. Some scientists have found that an insufficient recovery time is detrimental to performance. Others have shown that passive recovery is more beneficial. Some have found that active recovery impairs performance, whereas others have shown that AR hastens recovery from the previous bouts and improves an athlete's subsequent performance. Here's just a summary of some of the research articles that I looked at. As you can see, there is some inconsistencies. Some say that blood lactate levels are lowered during passive recovery, and some that say that it's higher during active recovery. As you can see, there's a bit of discrepancy. In previous studies, most of the focus has either been on cycling or swimming with longer recovery times, such as 3 minutes plus. There's actually been minimal research conducted on running-based RSI with short recovery times. The aim of this study was to compare the effects of active versus passive recovery during short repeated maximal sprints, which were performed at 95% of the sprinter's maximal sprint speed. We looked at blood lactate levels, fatigue index, split trials and total sprint time, heart rate and their perceived rate of exertion. Our hypothesis was that passive recovery would lead to improved performance of repeat sprint running compared to inactive recovery practices. Our null hypothesis that there would be no significant difference between the two recovery modes. Our participants were 10 physically active, healthy male and female Central Queensland students, and here are their demographics. We performed health screens prior to testing, and we also received their informed consent. Each participant did a standardised warm-up of 5 minutes of jogging with various leg swings, high knees and pulls, butt kicks and sumo squats, and then they did some jogging at various intensities and then did a practice run. There were two testing conditions involved, an active versus a passive recovery. The choice was randomised. It was a coin toss to determine which one they would do, and it was conducted over 2 days. The testing parameters were a 10 by 15 metre repeat maximal effort sprint, and it was a 22-second recovery in both cases. In the passive recovery, the sprinters remained stationary at the start of the sprint. in the active recovery, they remained actively jogging at 50% of their maximum speed, and they had to make sure they were back at the start line within 2 to 3 seconds before the start of the next sprint. Some of the outcomes that we measured were heart rate before the warm-up, at the start and the end of each sprint, and the completion of trials, and then for every minute for 5 minutes afterwards. Blood lactate was collected before the warm-up, at the completion of the trials, and 3 minutes post-exercise, and sprint times were collected over 5, 10 and 15 metre intervals, and at the end of each sprint we asked the sprinters what their RPE was based on the Borg scale. Here is a list of the equipment and manufacturers. Our study design was a randomised crossover study design. We reported using average, mean and standard deviations, and we used a paired 2 sample of means t-test on all variables. The alpha level was set at 0.05, and the data was analysed using Microsoft Excel. Here is an overview of the results that we obtained. As you can see, we obtained significant differences for post-sprint blood lactate, heart rate and RPE. All the other were insignificant. As you can see from this table, RPE was significantly different and was higher in the active recovery session, and for the post-sprint it was also higher for the active. Here is just a figure of the results of the blood lactate, showing higher levels for the post-sprint, which was significant. As can be seen from this table, we did not have any significant differences for average sprint time or split trials. And also for the fatigue index, there was no significance as well. We did find significance for heart rate. In this study, our hypothesis was not supported. We found significant differences in blood lactates, post-sprint heart rate and for RPE, and no significant differences in sprint performance or fatigue index. Mean heart rate was significantly higher in the active recovery than in passive recovery. A higher heart rate normally leads to higher muscle blood flow, and this increased delivery of oxygen to the muscles, therefore allowing for better resynthesis of phosphocreatine and removal of the cellular waste products. We found that the 22 seconds recovery was probably not long enough to restore the metabolic environment to normal, and as a result, sprint times during successive sprints were compromised. They did not improve, and there was also an increase in the post-lactate levels. Similar net lactate production was recorded for both active and passive in Greco's study, which is consistent with this study except for the post-lactate level. Researchers found short periods of high-intensity exercise increases blood lactate, and we saw this by comparing the warm-up to post-sprint in both passive and active, and it improved. Blood lactate increased for the post-sprint, and this accumulates during anaerobic work and leads to increased acidity of the blood in the muscles. We did find a lack of research studies comparing RPE with active and passive recoveries. In our study, RPE was higher for active. It was perceived that it took greater effort to produce similar split times when an active recovery was utilised. We found the effects of active recovery to increase RPE, blood lactate and heart rate. We found an insufficient recovery time for metabolic processes to be restored to homeostasis to ensure optimal performance. There were some limitations to this study. Some participants were involved in other testing and did not have a rest between trials. There was a large number of recorders, and this could have caused experimental error, and we also had a small number of participants. It was only n equals 10. So in concluding, we accept the null hypothesis that there were no significant differences in fatigue index, split times and total sprint time. This contradicts the widespread assumption that active recovery is beneficial in promoting blood lactate clearance after maximal sprinting. The optimal recovery mode to improve subsequent repeat sprint performance depends on the duration of the recovery period. If rest periods are short, passive recovery is better, but if it's going to be a longer duration, say longer than 3 minutes, an active recovery is more beneficial to subsequent sprint performance. Practical implications of this study. The choice of recovery type should be determined by the individual's workout goals or the type of sport the athlete is training for. Fitness level. If a person is less fit or inexperienced, they should probably use a passive recovery, but highly trained persons would gain greater benefit from active recovery, and this could also be used by coaches for talent identification. And further research could look at the relationship between active recovery, lactate removal, and performance. Gender differences, we should look at different rest periods between trials and look at replicating what's actually happening in a game. And we also need to look at the long-term effects of recovery mode on RSA training performance. I'd like to thank Aaron Scanlon and my fellow students, and just like to report that there were no conflicts of interest in this report. And here is a list of my references. Thank you very much for listening.